This is Inform Your Resistance with Political Research Associates, or PRA. Tune in monthly to hear experts, researchers, journalists, academics, and movement strategists explain some of the most significant contemporary threats to democracy from the mainstream and far right. With Inform Your Resistance, we distill what you need to know most. I'm your host, Koki Mendes, Communications Director here at PRA. For today's episode, I sit down with PRA's Principal Research Advisor, Steven Gardiner, to reflect on the ongoing U.S. and Israeli war with Iran. We discuss how this war differs so dramatically from previous U.S. wars of empire, its implications for domestic politics, especially in light of the upcoming 2026 midterm elections, and what it tells us about the Trump administration's authoritarian state-making project. We conclude with the most vital thing we can do in this moment to build effective resistance, both to the war and to rising authoritarianism. Steven, thank you for sitting down with me again today on short notice to talk about the newest of the Trump administration's overseas endeavors.
Always a pleasure, Koki. I'm really happy to be here to be able to talk about these things with you.
I'm also just really grateful that we have someone in-house with experience with the military, with analysis of the military, which can be somewhat outside of the mandate of PRA's focus on the social movement right. And we're seeing this borne out right now in a far-right presidential administration taking the country to war yet again. When you first learned of U.S. and Israeli strikes in Iran, what were your first thoughts and what were you monitoring or are you monitoring in real time?
My first thought was that this was anticipated because of the buildup, but my first thought was the arrogance of doing this kind of action without making any kind of public case, not to Congress, not to the American people, not to the world, not to our allies, other than Israel, presumably, and this, to me, says everything that you need to know about the kind of underlying attitude of the Trump administration. It's about what the administration wants to do, and they may want to do it for reasons that are opaque even to themselves or are distributed through various elements of the influences in the cabinet and beyond. So I'm thinking, wow, this is a setup for a colossal catastrophe. I mean, even by the standards of, say, the Iraq War, which was fought based on a lie that was fairly transparent to anyone who was paying attention, even at the time. It was sold by people who were selling their souls. I'm thinking of particularly, of course, of Colin Powell, who knew better and sold this anyway. But with this case, it's not even clear how the actions that they're going to take and have already taken will lead to any of the outcomes that they profess are the goals here. And it's kind of a scattershot, shotgun approach to what those goals are. Anyway, some of them contradictory, but yeah, I'm thinking, wow, a lot of blood, a lot of money is going to be spent. And a lot of whatever tiny fragments of goodwill towards American foreign policy may remain in the world remain in existence after so much unilateral, bellicose, and pointless activity. So those were the first things that I thought. My second thoughts were then about the domestic politics of this, and we can get into that in a minute.
Does the lack of coherent story and also the lack of attempt to fabricate one suggest a reversal in a relationship in which Israel has for so long been a tool of U.S. empire, and now the Trump administration has deployed U.S. military in service of Israeli aims?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting calculus, and I would say that what it comes down to is that if we are to believe the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the justification for the final decision to start bombing was that Israel said they were going to do it anyway, and that therefore it became a situation of self-defense for the United States in this very limited sense that the Iranians were quite likely to respond against American military bases in the region. So if they were going to do that and Israel was going to do the bombing anyway, then preemptively we were justified in Rubio's mind to start bombing. Now, of course, the politics of that are screwy as heck, but I mean, Israel is essentially a client state of the United States. I mean, how whatever, conspiracy theories may come along, I don't think I can imagine a Trump regime, if Israel didn't exist, that wouldn't do stuff like this. It might be slightly different stuff, but it would still be stuff like this. Why? Because of the kinds of people Trump has put in charge of the security state. I mean, we have Pete Hegseth, whose philosophy seems to be one of sort of fascistic, masculinist violence as a cure-all. The fact that he can't imagine, that none of them seem to be imagine why we're doing the violence, other than to brutalize the people and demonstrate that we are willing to do that. And of course, it's helpful from a public relations point of view that it's a vilified people, that these are Muslims, that this is Iran with whom the United States has disputes going back decades and so on.
Apparently 46 years of imminent threat of war.
Right. And no indication other than the one that Rubio gave about, well, Iran's probably going to launch missiles and drones at our bases if Israel attacks them, to indicate that there was any imminent threat. Well, I mean, of course, the bases we need to understand are nothing but a liability to the United States, taken as a rational actor on a conventional neo-imperialist stage. They're basically just putting people out there to get shot at.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Now, as we're 12 days into this war, what are you watching on the ground? What are you monitoring?
Well, I'm monitoring the kinds of daily responses that are coming up from the administration, from the legacy press, and from right-wing influencers who have, to a certain extent, been slow to, at least some of them have been slow to embrace this. Others are more like, well, let's just kill them all. They are buying hook and line into the message of violence and force makes right and makes good policy, whether or not it's right. We're looking at a draconian war executed with kind of Olympian powers of, air superiority and a preconception that we will not really have to risk major loss to life and limb. At the same time, understanding that we're putting Iran in a position where they have essentially no choice other than, in Donald Trump's phrase, unconditional surrender, but to continue fighting and to find some asymmetrical ways of doing that. That is, using unconventional forces to attack vulnerable targets, either in the sphere of allyship to the United States or in the United States itself, if they can possibly do it, which is something we need to think about, because it's entirely possible that the Iranians will conceive a asymmetrical attack, a terrorist attack on the United States that could do significant damage. Now, there was a FBI memo that went out a little while ago that's now hitting the press that warned that Iran could weaponize drones to attack the California coast. And my response to that was, are they saying that this could happen? That's what the memo says. It could happen. So this is the FBI sort of covering their behind and trying to look useful. But if we take the larger point, is it plausible that the Iranians might attempt an attack in the United States? Of course it's plausible. Now, the politics of that are complicated, because if it's more than a nuisance in military terms, then it becomes the one thing that could potentially unite the to produce a majority in favor of the war and flip the script on the high disapproval levels of the Trump regime. So the restraint from Iran on that might be a political calculus as much as a capacity calculus.
That makes a lot of sense. In terms of monitoring the domestic response, when you and I sat down to discuss the attack in Venezuela at the beginning of this year, we talked about the way in which the America First, the hypothetically isolationist wing of the far right, was fairly complacent in its response to Venezuela. What response and what talking points are you seeing emerge from that sector of the right now?
Well, I mean, of course, from some quarters, Tucker Carlson, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you see a kind of continuation of the kind of critique around Venezuela. You said America first, you lied, this is a problem, you're drawing us into a war. But then from the more sort of anti-Semitic neo-Nazi right, you're also seeing you're doing this for Israel. This is the kind of conspiracy theory of Jewish puppet masters, and you are under control of some international globalist forces that want you to do this. This is actually a quite interesting interpretation in that historically that conspiracy theory basically says that those forces, Jewish internationalists, controlled everything. Of course, we're kind of in a moment when that Jewish international, so-called in right-wing anti-Semitic conspiracy theory terms, is reduced to just Israel and the United States. There isn't anyone else who thinks this is a good idea. I suppose the Chinese might be looking at it and saying, could the United States bankrupt itself with this? That might be okay. But there's no one who thinks that this is good policy outside of the Trump regime and a few sort of habitual hawks.
Does this represent a salient, a promising fracture on the right? I've been thinking about sort of the way in which Tucker Carlson has become increasingly at odds with the Trump administration. Does that mean he is losing influence, or does that mean the MAGA base is fracturing?
A little of both. I mean, certainly Carlson is losing influence. And we could see this with Marjorie Taylor Greene taking a similar kind of position, who's now, of course, on the outside, no longer in Congress, resigned, recognizing the marginality of her position if she wanted to do anything but applaud at every full stop in the regime's continuing patter of war making. It's interesting, of course, in terms of what the base thinks. I think that the disapproval for the war levels are now at a point where they're clearly eating into the MAGA base. So there are probably those who are still justifying in terms of, well, they're not, going to entangle us in some decades-long thing by sending soldiers to be there on the ground. This isn't an infantry war. We're not in an sort of an exchange of ordinary warfare bellicosity. We're dropping bombs on them. But honestly, the lack of clarity about what they're trying to accomplish has to be confusing to anyone. Now, of course, you have some on the Christian right, the Christian Zionist right, who see this as a necessary step in the defense of the production of the apocalypse, the production of the end times. And there are reports, reliable if not completely confirmed, that some lower level commanders preached this to their troops. You should be proud you're part of bringing Jesus back to the world, which of course resulted in lots of complaints to civil liberties organizations who are like, what, you're sending me to bomb someone to bring Jesus back? How is that supposed to work? And by the way, I'm Jewish, or I'm Muslim, or I'm an atheist, or I'm a Christian who doesn't believe in the end times as a product of human activity.
Fascinating to hear about end times rhetoric really being deployed by the state in a moment of war making, the way in which the Christian Zionist segment of the Christian right has really become part and parcel of this administration. So with the deeply unpopularness of this war and its lack of coherent storytelling, how does the conditions of this war in particular complicate or exacerbate the Trump administration's authoritarian goals and progress? And how does it interact with an ongoing effort on the ground to continue to deploy extensive mass deportation?
Right. Well, this is a complicated interaction. Presumably, there was someone somewhere in the political advising team to the administration who thought that this was a roll of the dice and that it might be popular, because essentially there's a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Iranian bigotry in the United States. So something to play on, something to work with, and then the fear of a nuclear-armed Iran that has been sold by not just this administration, but every administration in post-1979 since the Iranian Revolution world. So there was at least some sense maybe that could happen. But the domestic deployment of violence, the security state of the United States, war abroad is always used, I mean, historically and structurally, you can see why this would be true, as an increased justification for lowering the threshold for justification of use of force at home. Why? Because, well, we're at war with a foreign enemy, and your actions, if you're opposing domestic actions by the regime, you are, in effect, aiding and comforting the enemy. So that is the issue there. However, the Trump administration has a kind of, focus problem in terms of where it's going to put its energy. This is, in some ways, accidental brilliance in that it can just keep moving on. The churn, there's no like perfect goal that they want other than what they said this morning. It's really, kind of 1984 sort of maneuver where whoever we're fighting right now, doesn't matter what we were doing yesterday, is the important thing to fight. So now it's Iran. Last week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, it was Venezuela. Then it was crime in Minneapolis, supposedly being committed by immigrants. And before that, it was something else and something else and something else. It's, the Mexican drug cartels who are going to attack the American border, whatever it is they're claiming, or drug traffickers in the Caribbean. It's one justification after another. And what they're doing as a strategy is to basically set themselves up so they don't actually have to accomplish anything. They just declare victory. Now, the problem is that you declare victory after victory after victory and nothing actually ever changes, except maybe things get worse. And even the most devoted followers start to say, wait, why did we do that again? It so happens that the resources of the United States are so vast that the kinds of drawdown on our power and capacity take a lot of mishandling to really be affected by people. But I have a partially humorous, but partially, I think, actual, I don't know if it's the strategy, but I think it's the limits to the strategy they're currently using. They're just going to drop every bomb and shoot every missile that they have. And when they run out, they'll say they won. And then, some of the professional military people, even General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Trump appointed as a sort of hand-picked agent of bellicosity, did take a beat to say, well, we're going to have to replace all of those. And I'm saying that's probably the point underlying, because Iranian oil, we're probably never going to get our hands on that. Not going to be able to steal it outright. Now, in the meantime, of course, the prices of oil are going up, making American oil that much more viable. I think we talked about this in the context of Venezuela. In fact, it's now over $100 a barrel, or it is tending in that direction, which is the price point for, drill, baby, drill in the United States. But what is for sure is that money that we will have to spend to replace all those munitions so there's going to be tens of billions of dollars probably, will be paid by American taxpayers and go into the pockets of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the price of gas or the price of oil, in one hand, is increasing the value of U.S. oil. It's also being directly felt by consumers, domestic consumers, and it is an early sign of discontent from the MAGA base with this war in particular. What other sort of material implications, in addition to the cost of oil and taxation, do you think the American populace will face as a result of this war?
Well, I mean, this is an open question, but we see volatility in the stock market, which doesn't necessarily impact ordinary people's day-to-day, but it does impact the ways in which American corporations and large-scale employers think about what they're doing. And when they see volatility in the stock market, they start thinking downsizing. Mm-hmm. They start thinking relocating more labor to some place where things are less volatile. They start thinking, because this is how you stabilize your stock prices. You fire a bunch of people and the stock price stabilizes or even goes up. And so, yeah, this is part of that picture that we could be looking at. And then the other side of this, for the economic picture in the United States, is that we don't know where this war is going. I mean, they could declare victory next week and just pull the fleet back and stop fighting. But a major terrorist attack in the United States, real or staged, could lead to a massive influx of new funding into economically useless activity, the way it did after 9/11. And so this is uncertainty, and this is part of course, what the stock market is reacting to. I mean, they have to know where they need to put their money. Do they want to put it into safe stuff, or do they want to make bets on putting it into security companies and surveillance companies and the Palantirs and the big military hardware manufacturers and the mercenary companies and so on?
It's interesting, too. I mean, this is all happening in the context of massive AI infrastructure investment as well, with the onset of a potentially long, potentially short, extremely costly war. This is a moment in U.S. history of really significant expenditure across the board, simultaneous with consumers experiencing a contraction of of affordability. And so I think this will be a really interesting moment for understanding economic tensions in the context of U.S. governance. Zooming out for a minute, this so-called forever wars in the service of regime change, which this war does not have that same framing or inevitability about it. These forever wars have long since been a facet of U.S. empire. And we're in a moment in which U.S. empire is occurring in the context of an erosion of international neoliberal norms and an erosion of a moralistic Western paternalism, which I think we see in some ways with the lack of rationale given for the attacks in Iran. What does this signal for you about the viability of a war-making project as a project of empire?
It suggests a downward trajectory, but downward trajectory of the possibilities of empire, even where the violence of empire could simultaneously increase. Why? Because the thing about the neoliberal foreign policy realists were, unlike the chair folk of a corporate board and the CEO who lived and died on quarterly profits, they could think about 10, 50 years into the future and how to stabilize controls and prevent countries from successfully implementing something other than regressive austerity policies. So they could think about, how do we keep those people from successfully having national health care and free public transit and universal education? Because we don't want those things. Those are bad for profits long term, or bad for the way we think of profitability. Their eclipse, the eclipse of the neoliberals, means that the people who are running things are thinking about the same kinds of things that the CEOs are thinking about, quarterly profits, except for in a much more bounded kind of way. By bounded, I mean they don't know that they're going to stay in power for very long. They don't think of themselves as permanent, or at least there's some of them who recognize they need to steal as much as they possibly can right now. And I use that word advisedly. I mean, it includes both, dubious transfers of wealth to military corporations, military hardware corporations, so on, but it also includes the graft that is coming off the top. It includes the increased reliance on artificial intelligence and the infrastructure that it is costing to build out. Which, of course, this is another piece of this puzzle. As the gas prices go up and people experience that, the United States is mostly transferred away from oil-driven power plants for electricity. However, with the construction of all of these data centers to run this AI, they're now becoming the major consumer or major new consumer of electricity, which is pushing everyone's electricity bills up at the same time. So at the consumer level, we're experiencing this, but also in terms of pure capacity, that how are we going to generate all of this electricity, and the water use is also extreme for data centers. And the lack of transparency and the lack of democratic oversight and the refusal to regulate and the Project 2025 attack on any kind of regulatory apparatus. I mean, set aside regulation of AI as an ethical level and, its impact on what it means to be human and so on and so forth. Just it's the impact of its being used at all on the environment, on the economy, on the labor force. It's, a few activists who are caring about this. I mean, I don't mean to denigrate their efforts. They're doing great work, but the Congress of the United States is like, oh, there's nothing can be done. It's like a force of nature.
I think that one of the things that is really interesting about the conversation that we're having today is that there are so many variable factors today relative to previous U.S. war-making efforts that it will be really interesting and really important to watch and understand the interactivity as we've been discussing. And I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about the timing as well of this war in Iran is the lead up to the midterm elections. And, the week prior to the attacks on Iran in late February, mainstream media learned of explicit plans from Trump-aligned activists to curtail electoral democracy in advance of the midterms. We are no longer seeing that analysis on the front page of our major news outlets. How do you interpret this interactivity between a war of incoherence, distraction, and violence for violence sake with more coordinated movement from electoral disruptors? And sort of what does this tell us about what can we possibly expect from the midterms with this ongoing dynamic in place?
Well, and we can throw into that the political consequences of the war as it exists right now. Of course, assuming it goes on for some time, it can current trajectory only have negative impacts on the electability of MAGA-aligned candidates.
Unless there's an attack, right?
Unless there's some kind of a domestic attack, unless something changes, either domestic attack or a credible enough declaration of victory and a celebration of the might of U.S. empire, which doesn't even have to put many of our soldiers at risk overseas. So the that this adds to the plausibility of attempts to instigate or enact types of political intimidation and political violence that will limit access to polling places, for example. I mean, we have Steve Bannon calling for encircling polling places with ICE agents, which Bannon has the role of being sort of this signal person who puts the stuff out there and sees what the reaction is. And what actually happens may not be quite as extreme as what he said, what he recommends. But between that and, selective immigration enforcement being declared near polling stations to protect the vote from fraud, which that case is one that continues the case of massive non-citizen voting in the United States being a factor in elections. I mean, of course, no evidence that this exists. And that's a weak way of saying it. We can more or less say that it doesn't exist, that anyone who does this, it's essentially been by accident or because of some kind of misunderstanding or mental health issue. There's no campaign to make this happen and no significant number of people doing it, and it has never affected the outcome of an election that has been demonstrated. But anyway, this could have a significant impact on what happens at the polls, people staying away from polls. We saw in the 2024 election an increasing number of Latinx folk voting for Trump. Those numbers, the polling numbers, are drastically declining, drastically. The Trump administration probably has a pretty good sense that keeping them away from the polls is a good idea. Similarly, when you talk about any kind of security state presence at or near polling places, then you're talking about, in order to quote unquote maintain order, for example, then you're talking about intimidation. You're talking about the people who are most vulnerable historically to state violence being less likely to come to the polls. And this is in turn going to have an impact. Now, what the Trump administration is low-key panicking about is that their opposition seems to be more motivated to get to the polls, at least in the run-up to these primaries, than in the past. And they didn't quite expect that for whatever reason. They just assumed that at least their base would continue to be heavily motivated. Of course, that base is probably looking ahead and saying, Trump's not going to be in office forever. We don't necessarily like the next 2 or 3 guys on the list. They're not our guy. They don't represent our dream of a authoritarian leader who actually represents what we want. I mean, J.D. Vance, not exactly a charismatic figure, and clearly allied with people who are mostly about how can I make another $10 billion this month.
Rubio, though, has shown up more in force. I mean, certainly as a mouthpiece of the administration during these acts of aggression. Do you have a read on Rubio's popularity with Trump voters?
Yeah, I mean, Rubio certainly has a base of support, but it's more in the traditional conservative hawk, Catholic right sorts of folks, and his hyper focus on Cuba is not going to be attractive to a lot of people who say, what Cuba, what that's the place where the cigars come from. What do we care? Americans not being very good at this sort of thing, and we haven't spent, in spite of the economic stranglehold and political diplomatic stranglehold the United States has exercised against Cuba since forever. The Cold War's been over a long time, and people are discontinuing to care, especially when it looks like even the administration is turning to deporting Cuban refugees at this point. And so the idea that should be a big issue for people is going to be a hard sell. China probably, if Rubio can construct himself as a China hawk, which is plausible, then that would probably carry more weight. But it's going to be hard for him to construct himself as someone who is a populist champion of MAGA land values. So he's plausible, but as a candidate, but I don't know that he's going to be able to carry the MAGA nation banner forward. I think it's possible that we don't know who would do this yet. A minor character who talks a big game might be might be someone who could emerge. We'll have a better idea of all of this after the midterms, of course. There'll be deep panic if whatever efforts are made in the midterms to restrict voting and voters fail, and there's a significant shift in Congress. I think that at that point, you will see panic in MAGA land as people get in line to make sure that they get their preemptive pardons before Trump leaves office.
It also seems that the MAGA base has been swayed for so long by a cult of personality that the idea of a successor to the Trump administration that does not have the same charismatic leadership will certainly demobilize the MAGA electorate.
Yeah, I mean, to make that transition, you have to kind of be willing to invest in bureaucratic kinds of infrastructure. And while the Trump administration has certainly, changed the federal bureaucracy considerably, it has not significantly expanded the capacity of the Republican Party, for example, to be a party of a forever leadership movement. They control it. They've controlled it for the last several years, but they're not exactly gaining members in leaps and bounds, even in office. And then using the federal bureaucracy at the same time that you're decimating it is a tough job. The virtually the only element that is only two elements that are increasing are the military and Department of Homeland Security. Even in the Justice Department and the FBI, they've lost and not been able to replace folk. So that is a diminution of capacity to use the state simply by diminution of the number of people who are within it. So ICE now becomes the go-to folk because they're new hires, they're people who signed on for this mission, whatever the president wants, and they're increasing in numbers instead of decreasing. And, how plausible is it to use these half-trained agents to do something other than immigration enforcement? Doesn't mean they won't try. Well, they would call it defending the capacity of the federal government to take care of itself. I mean, the military has increased as well, its budget. And there'll be a appropriation, probably a big one, perhaps more than one, to fight this war, depending on how long it goes on, subsidiary appropriation that will pass, that Democrats will vote for because they have to, quote unquote, support the troops.
We haven't even talked about the sidelining of Congress since the beginning of the year, but certainly most significantly in this moment. And I think that's an important point in terms of thinking about the project of authoritarianism, that this administration has not rebuilt a gutted bureaucracy to be regime loyal, and in so doing has not created the infrastructure necessary for a durable, ongoing project of authoritarianism beyond the charismatic head of state. I mean, I think the idea of ICE as the authoritarian state in body is, I mean, like you sort of suggest, is fairly limited in applicability. So what are some implications for the war in Iran, the upcoming midterms, for our core audience, for our organizers? for the social movement left? What can we be doing to turn the lack of support for the war in our favor as we continue to build a movement of resistance?
Yeah, the first thing we have to continue to be resilient, and that includes preparing for the possibility of some kind of staged or actual attack on American soil or near American soil, say on an aircraft carrier or something that could kill thousands of people, and have some talking points and understandings available going into that without fear-mongering, but understanding that this will inevitably lead to calls for and probably capitulation to efforts to increase surveillance, increase repression, make it harder to do the ordinary business of democracy, even in the limited form that it exists in the United States. So there's that. There's the resilience piece. The other side is to not be afraid of pointing to the lack of purpose of this administration. It is doing nothing but putting money into its own pockets and that of its cronies, while blaming people who have no power for whatever problems that people actually have, and lying about, this is obvious, but lying about the results that they're getting. So we have to continue to resist by preparing ourselves mentally and through increasing our associations with people who we can recruit to be in community together. The main thing that people need to do is, it's like if I had one thing, it's like find the like-minded people or the close to like-minded people or the people who at least dislike the same things that you dislike and talk to them personally about being involved. This is the saturation of understanding around social media and AI and so on as being generators of political activity has basically saturated us with incoherence. And it's really face-to-face conversations that we are forgetting how to do and that we need if we're going to organize against an authoritarian push. So this is reaching out to 5 people, 10 people who who like you and saying, I would really like it if you would come to this meeting where we're going to talk about this war and its consequences for us. I would really like it if you would get involved in this get out the vote activity. I would really like it if you would get involved in doing this training of election for election security. So this is the top of my list. And then the organizational support for that is people in the movement left have to be ready to absorb those people while continuing to push out that message that we need to recruit people one at a time through our own family and friends network, even when that's not comfortable. There isn't an example of a successful anti-authoritarian movement in recent history that didn't involve this kind of person-to-person recruitment and mobilization of people to do what was necessary.
I think that's both a large scale and also very personalized plan that our listeners, that we as individuals can really focus on and feel meaningfully participatory. Thank you so much, Steven, for the many vagaries of our conversation, the ground that we've covered today. I think this is, a really interesting and important moment in history, and I'm really grateful to be able to pick your brain during it.
Thank you, Koki. Great to be here as always.
Thank you for listening to Inform Your Resistance with PRA. Today's episode was hosted by me, Koki Mendes. The podcast is produced by Olivia Lawrence Wildman, and Frank Lawrence created our music. If you haven't already, rate, review, and subscribe. And if you appreciate our work, please consider donating to Political Research Associates at politicalresearch.org. But the best thing you can do to help us is to tell your comrades about the pod. A shared analysis makes our resistance movement stronger, and we need you to spread the word. Until next time.